Welcome back. Great decisions. Today, of course, we're going to be looking at human trafficking. And as always, I'm going to say a couple things about some upcoming events. First of all, you've probably been wondering about the International Speaker Series. It has been anticipated. It has been thought about. People have been saying, when are you going to announce it? When are you going to announce it? And hold on to your bonnets and your borsalinos because we will be announcing it next week. What I will tell you right now is that the theme of the series this year is World Warning Contents Under Pressure. So all the big issues that are threatening to cleave us apart. So that's all I'm going to say right now, but pay attention next week when we announce all of the names of all the wonderful people who are going to come here and present some very, very urgent, relevant, exciting, and perhaps even sexy topics on global affairs. Next week we have Yang Zhao, one of the best thinkers in the nation on the education system, on public education. Pretty much every year when Ed Week comes out with their ranking of thinkers around public education, Yang Zhao sits there at the top around Diane Ravitch and Joel Klein and people like that, and he is one of our own. He's at the U of O, and he is speaking on who's afraid of the big bad dragon, why China has the best and the worst education system in the world. We're doing this at Oregon Historical Society, where our offices are, down in the pavilion there. So Tuesday, February 17th, 6:30 p.m. He is not only brilliant, he is so funny. If he were not an incredible educational theorist, he would be a great stand-up comedian. So if he can fit the punchline of Sputnik moment in there somewhere, I guarantee you he will. On the 25th, we have Dr. Bates Gill, the former director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, looking at the future of the U.S. and our rebalance to Asia, and looking at how we have sort of made that tilt to look at the Pacific Rim and what we are gaining, what we are losing, what we are, what kind of focus this is in terms of thinking about U.S. military, economic, and diplomatic policy in the Pacific Rim. And the other thing I thought I would tell you is next week, if you're wondering, somebody came up earlier, this young lady over here came up earlier and wanted to know if we had a listing of the events, because they're not in the same order that they are in the book. And that's because sometimes people can talk certain weeks and sometimes they can't. So they're not always in the order that they're in the book. But if you're curious, these are up at the table there. Next week we will have my pal Tagrul Keskin talking on U.S. policy toward Africa. He is teaches international and Middle East studies here at PSU, and he's the editor of a fascinating journal called The Sociology of Islam. Fantastic thinker. So that will be great. And then on the theme of human trafficking, we were given a grant last summer to show this film called Not My Life by Robert Bilheimer, which our speaker today participated in a panel around. And as part of doing this, they gave us a lot of copies of it. And I didn't bring a ton of them, but if you want a copy of this film and you will promise me that you will, A, actually watch it, and B, give it to somebody who's invested in these issues and you think that they might be able to glean some valuable information, then take one. They are free. I actually have more in my office, so if they're gone at the end of the day and you really want one, you can get in touch with us and we can definitely give you a copy. And then today, we have with us Christopher Carey from the School of Community Health. That is right. I announced somebody last week and their bio and everything had changed. He is a former deputy district attorney and currently associate professor in the School of Community Health. His research focuses on human rights programs and laws with an emphasis on human trafficking. He has worked with groups to improve collaboration within the field of human rights and has worked internationally to address human trafficking, safe migration, and gender-based violence through culturally grounded, rights-based solutions. He's also served as the editor of the first book on legal precedents on human trafficking in Nepal, and the California judicial system has identified him as an expert in human trafficking and intercultural communication, and he has provided expert testimony in criminal and immigration cases. In 2013, also, Chris and Lena Tablitsky co-authored a PSU report that was commissioned by the Department of Justice that provided some very, very mind-blowing and hard data about child trafficking in the Portland metro area, which you'll hear about today, and I believe you're going to also hear some updates on that nobody else has heard yet. So you guys are like, I was saying it's like you guys are on the guest list for the party. So before anyone else gets this information, you're going to get a sneak peek at some, I would venture to say, probably equally mind-blowing and pretty powerful stats on what's happening in Portland and how that connects out to the global issue. To move away from the darkness of trafficking, when not learning about the world from his Eli and Lila, he can be found fly fishing the rivers and climbing the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, because Chris Carey is one of us. So give him a hand.
You know, I'm never really sure what to say after that bio gets read, because I always fear that I can't live up to what it is in there. And I'm like, God, is that really me as I look in the mirror? But I guess it is. So thank you for coming today on a Friday where we have some sunshine in the Pacific Northwest, which is a wonderful thing here in February. I'm going to do two things today. I'm going to talk first about the problem of trafficking, or we called it human trafficking, the challenge of the 21st century, although you hear a lot of that, right? Terrorism, the challenge of the 21st century, Alzheimer's, the challenge of the 21st century. So we have many challenges of the 21st century. This happens to be one of them. So I'm going to talk generally about this first, and then, as Tim said, about a year and a half ago, along with my graduate assistant, now a Master's of Public Health and employee at OHSU, Lena Teplitsky, were commissioned by the Department of Justice, specifically Amanda Marshall in the U.S. Attorney's Office here, to take a look at human trafficking and specifically what we call CSEC, the commercial sexual exploitation of children here in Portland. That was the first study. We were then commissioned by the State Department of Justice to do a second phase. The first study looked at breadth. This study looks at depth, and that's the kind of new findings which we're going to release today. You're going to get some just aggregate data. This is literally hot off the presses. So we haven't had the opportunity to analyze this. Could you turn the speaker down a little bit? Are you guys getting some reverb in the front here? So thank you. So we're going to do that. I'll speak. I know we have to be out of here, so I will probably talk for 30 minutes or so, although as my students know, I love to talk, so I'll try to keep it as limited as possible. And then we'll have lots of times, hopefully, for questions. I have way too many PowerPoint slides, so if you want to come back to something, certainly let me know. And the new report will probably be released in the next couple of weeks, and we'll make that available at the World Affairs Council. Maybe they can post a link on their website so you can get it. So I want to begin a little differently. Let me see a raise of hands. How many people actually read the chapter in Great Decisions? You don't have to lie. That's OK. All right. I told you guys in the front row, right? My students know what's the front row reserved for? What's the front row reserved for? The hot seat. We call it the hot seat, right? So for questions and answers, but I'll open it up to everybody. I want to start with a question. And this is for anybody. Just raise your hand. We'll take a couple of these. For those of you that read it, or those of you that skimmed it, or talked to somebody, or know about the issue, is there something particular in the article that struck you, or resonated with you, or concerned you? So anything from the article, from the research, to the interventions, to the scope of the problem. Anybody feel brave? And, oh, look at that.
How they're all tied together and interwoven in the article.
All of the different types of trafficking and the places there are. And abuse of women and children and boys. And in fact, yeah, and men as well, right? So we look at this global scale of interconnection. I think that's a really good point. Anything else? Yes?
A lot of times we think that this doesn't happen in the United States, and it's a very big problem here. We tend to think, oh, this is a third world country.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. So we tend to look at this internationally, and in fact, when the United States first formed what's called the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, which is an arm of the State Department in 2000, they do what's called a GTIP report, a Trafficking in Persons report, and we happen to rank every other country in the world except for ourselves, actually. So this was something that we kind of looked at and do. That's changed now, and we have really extensive programs and evaluations here as much as they can. One more comment. Okay.
How unreliable the statistics are?
Okay, I was hoping somebody would say that because I'm one of those unreliable statisticians, right? So this is a pretty alarming number here. So I'm going to use some numbers in my presentation which are a little different than some of them in the readings. But does anybody remember the spread of the millions of people that the author thought that they went between? Yes. Between 4 and 27 million. That's a big margin of error that we quote. You know, I would not be able to get away with that margin of error if I submitted this to some sort of publication. But there's a lot of reasons for that and challenges for that. One of the things that I actually kind of disagree that the report pointed out is that in the new report, the government says, you know, the standardized data isn't very good. We want academics and researchers to just focus on individual case studies. And I actually think that's kind of the wrong approach. I think as academics and as researchers and as policymakers, we need to go to those research problems that are really tough to crack. We need to spend hours trying to figure this out. And I'm going to talk to you about some of my struggles in the work that I did here in Portland. So I can see this is not a shy group at all, which is great. So here we go. Trafficking Worldwide. ILO, which is the International Labor Organization, arm of the UN, estimates there are 20.9 million victims of human trafficking worldwide. You know from the numbers. How do you get those numbers? Well, some are self-reporting, some are good, educated guesses, and as we know from the data, countries report differently. So this is really a guesstimate. Of that, 5.5 million are kids, and 14.2 are victims of labor exploitation. So this is something that happens all over the globe, in every country and in every state. The mass of the problem is really overwhelming if you think about it on a large scale. And we first started to do this work back in 1998, 97, even before the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking was formed in 2000. It was so overwhelming that all we could do was focus on one village in one rural area of Nepal. And that's a lecture for another time if you're interested. Global human trafficking, which is kind of where my work was, 20% of all modern SAIDs are 5.5 million or under 18. Broken down, you can break it down by sex or gender. Many of the girls go into commercial sexual exploitation. Many of the boys serve as labor, either as indentured servitudes, on fishing boats, in huge industries, both abroad. And we had quite a history of that in the United States until child labor laws, which are a pretty recent creation. Okay, trafficking in the United States. So this is a tricky one since definitions have changed a little bit. But the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and they do a pretty good job at getting the research correct. Although, again, this is a very, very difficult thing to research because you have hidden populations. You have people that aren't exactly jumping out and saying, oh, yeah, I'm a trafficked person. And then you have one particular issue with the research, which my students heard about last week, which we call the problem with question number 11. About 9 years ago, I went into India to do a program evaluation of an NGO that was receiving State Department funds. They were receiving State Department funds to host and have a trafficking shelter. There were supposed to be 100 women in the trafficking shelter. The State Department said, go do a program evaluation. So we went in with a questionnaire. We asked health-related questions, causal-related questions, demographic-related questions. But we got to question number 11 on the survey, and it said, when were you trafficked? And 98% of the respondents said, oh, I wasn't trafficked. That wasn't me. My friends were over here. And so we went back and we said, wow, this is really interesting because 2 of the people that you have here report being trafficked. And of course, the problem the problem with the question was that it didn't take things like the human condition or culture into effect. There is shame, there are cultural traditions, and so we don't ask that question anymore. We ask other questions about force, fraud, or coercion, conditions of confinement, but we don't ask that question. The problem with that is it's difficult to get a read on that. That's just one example. So what these guys do is they go in and they look at cases of children that are reported missing in the United States. And these are their estimates. 100,000 youths under the age of 18 engaged in the commercial sex trade. And this can be working with a pimp, working on their own. But we know when there is a runaway, especially if it's a girl under the age of 18, we know that within 24 hours, there is a more than 50% likelihood that she'll be contacted by somebody in the commercial sex industry to pull her in. They estimate 1 in 8 runaways reported to the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, were victims. So if we know 1 of 8 reported, what do we know about that number? Go ahead. What do we know about that number? It's only the reported ones, right? So we know that's our base. That's not even our baseline. We know that the number is somewhere higher than that, probably much higher. Okay. Definitional aspects of trafficking. This is a debate that the trafficking community has been having for a while. You'd think that we'd be able to all agree on what trafficking is and what it is not. I'm not going to kind of get into these debates, but I'm going to tell you there are 2 main definitions. The first one is the one up here, and it's from something called the Palermo Protocol, which is when the United Nations got together in 2000 in Palermo, Italy, and all the countries said, we're going to define trafficking as this. The second major definition, which I'm not going to talk about today, is the one that we use in the United States. It's derived from a law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and its amendments, and it's been amended about 5 times since it originally passed in 2000. But I'm going to break this down for you in a second here. So the definition consists of 3 core elements. And so there's been a lot of confusion. Is trafficking prostitution? Is trafficking migrant smuggling? If somebody comes across the border illegally and ends up working someplace and then can't leave, is that trafficking? And that's a specific case which we could talk about in a second. So 3 main parts of this. The first one is the action of trafficking, which includes the following: recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. So you have to have some movement. It does not have to be across international borders. It does not have to be across states. It doesn't even have to be across cities. You actually have some case law on this, but they say movement of any kind. So if I take you from here to this side of the room, we have worked for the purposes of some exploitive against your will, and you're over 18, then we have the first prong of this definition set. The second prong of the definition says threat, use of force, fraud, deception, or coercion, or abuse of power, or a position of vulnerability. So what that means is that I get you to do something against your will, and I get that either through force, fraud, or coercion, or some part of my abuse of power and abuse of position. And this later part came out because what was happening in the early cases is migrants were coming over, legally or not, in this country and other countries, and an employer or a trafficker was holding their passports and saying, you have to go to work, or we're not going to give you your visa or passport or documentation back. And the clever defense attorneys said, well, that's not force, fraud, or coercion, right? We're not doing anything they choose. We're just withholding these documents. And so that was also changed. This applies unless you have somebody under 18. Do you know why this doesn't apply if you're under 18? Pardon me? You're a child, so children can't consent legally. And so you have to have force, fraud, or coercion. If you take a child and traffic them, any movement, you don't have to demonstrate that part. Which is quite interesting when you get to these cases. And remember, I'm a former prosecutor, so my first frame on this was a law enforcement frame. I now sit in the School of Community Health here, and that's a very different frame to look at the world, a public health frame model as opposed to a law enforcement model. But this was really important because for the same reason that we had problems with question number 11 is the same problem you have with survivors and victims of trafficking, especially if they're in a pimp-prostitute relationship. Because many, many times, especially here in Portland, the first thing, and many times it's a gendered relationship. The men are the pimps, the young girls are the prostitutes. But you always hear, he loves me, I love him, he wouldn't do this, you don't understand. I can't tell you how many times we've heard that in the process as we've moved forward here. And it's challenging from a legal perspective to prosecute those cases. The final element is the purpose of trafficking, which is exploitation. The question is, what is exploitation? So we used to list these things, but then we decided to define it a little broader. Exploitation means at a minimum prostitution, other forms of exploitation, forced labor or slavery, practice similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. So if I take somebody and they're going to work on my farm on the Oregon coast, and I've brought them over here and I keep them there and say they can't leave, and I say, you know what, I know I told you I'd pay you $10 an hour, but I'm only going to pay you $3. You actually have a trafficking case. They're not free to leave, they're there, and you're exploiting them. You're paying them less than the minimum wage. So 2 big things. Are they free to leave? And sometimes that is a difficult question because of the psychological things that come along with this. And is the purpose for what they're doing exploitive? Types of trafficking. And here I've just listed 5. You can probably come up with other ones. The one we hear about the most is sexual exploitation. It's the most salacious one. It's the one that gets all the headlines. But in fact, it's just one part of the issue. Forced labor, domestic servitude. These are enormous problems in the United States, but also abroad, especially places like the Middle East and South Asia, places where I broke my teeth in Nepal and India and Bangladesh. You have generations of domestic or indentured servitude. People paying off debts from their fathers and grandfathers over and over and over again. It took a little while to that to be recognized as trafficking because there are some cultural manifestations against that as well. Organ harvesting. This originally was excluded from some of the trafficking. But with the rise and in the increase in organ harvesting and the difficulty it is to get organs, you see this over and over again in many places. The really interesting cases come up where somebody says, somebody approached me, I can't support my family, and they offered me $250 for my kidney. So I went into this place, which wasn't exactly sanitary, and I gave them my kidney. Is that coercion and trafficking? Those are difficult cases there. Because what constitutes coercion? What constitutes trafficking? Is it things like structural violence, like poverty, discrimination against women? Is that enough for coercion in itself? Most of the court cases say no right now. There has to be what they call a specificity of instances in order to be successful in a certain type of case. Okay, several of you have identified this, and this young lady over here identified the connections here, but these are what we call interlocking oppressions. Poverty, gender discrimination, crime and greed drives this probably more than anything else I've seen before. Because if you took the money out of things, then it's shocking. It's shocking the lack of markets or the lack of, if you remove money making and the greed from certain illicit activities, you'd be surprised at how fast they dry up overnight. Inequate educational and employment opportunities, and this actually, along with some folks, Nicholas Kristof as well, who I know was here last week, identify as the #1 issue. We know that if girls don't get past a 5th grade education, they have a much higher risk of being exploited, and that's around the globe. That's not specific to just developing countries. Globalization and economic liberalization, relaxed controls against borders, increased trade, increased movement and migration of people. The world migrates. Human societies have migrated for thousands and thousands of years. We've tried to do a lot of things like put up walls to stop migration, and frankly, it just really doesn't work that well. So with an increase in flow and an increase in economic liberalization, what that needs to be accompanied with is what we call safe migration corridors. These ideas that migration is inevitable, but we need to work on this. But in many places of the world, these just simply don't exist. In several places, the border from Nepal to India is a little arm that comes down at 6 o'clock, and so then the border guards go home, and so you're just supposed to wait there, but you could just actually kind of walk across it. I can imagine if that would like be at what's the entrance into Canada, right up in down there, or Tijuana. Okay, responses to trafficking. So this is. Trafficking has been around for thousands of years. We just never called it human trafficking before. In fact, that term is a really recent creation. The United States government formed what's called the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, and very much had a really strong hand in framing this issue. They're an arm of the State Department, which means they're a political arm. But it also means that their focus has been a lot on a law enforcement frame, a crime. And these first three is what we had for about the first 10 years. Prevention, awareness programs, education programs, keeping people there, trying to identify risk factors. So that's one area that programs fall under. Prosecution, we spent a lot of time trying to train prosecutors and judges, both in this country and abroad, on how to try these cases, on what standards of evidence are, on how to collect these cases, on what victim statements are, on what PTSD is, and how to deal with trauma victims and what they call trauma-centered justice and victim-centered justice. And my experience with that is honestly mixed. Some programs really work, but in Nepal, back in the day, the average prosecutor had about 500 to 600 cases in Kathmandu, 500 to 600. So it's great if you bring them to a training in the Hilton in Kathmandu, but then 3 days later, they have all this really good knowledge, but they go back to their desk and they still have 500 cases. So again, and these cases are really difficult. There's lots of moving parts here. There's survivors, which don't always cooperate as the prosecutors think they should, defendants, lots of moving pieces of evidence here. So for years, these cases were loser cases. And in a place like India, that's a really big deal with where the prosecutors lose the majority of their cases. Protection. What happens once a victim or survivor has been rescued? And even that term, rescued, is highly contentious, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what does that mean? Where do they go? Do we house them? Do we house them and care for their needs? Do they need to be saved? And is that our job to do that, either spiritually or mentally? And is that woven into the program? What about job retraining? What about years down the line? These are very expensive things, and most grants and most programs are written so they have 1 to 2 to 3 year turnaround times, and there are these things called performance measures and objectives and goals and things that you need to fill out. I'm not saying those are bad things. I'm just saying it's really difficult to quantify a poetry program in Kalighat, which is a huge area, red light area of Nepal, where you have what's called second and third generation trafficking victims, which are actually the kids and the grandkids of sex workers there. And you have a poetry program which helps them build identity and craft and write books, and Nicholas Kristof writes about it, and it goes to the Seagull bookstore. How do you quantify that? How do you tell people that that program is working? These are all challenges. So this last one has been recent, the last 4 years, maybe 5 years. Traditionally, a lot of our international development has gone to doing things like building bridges and wells. We've been more challenged with things like reducing poverty, reducing child exploitation. And the idea of what we call capacity building, and there are many other experts in the room, Dr. Frankel is over there, about capacity building than I am, but the idea that you need to help strengthen the problem, that in Nepal, unless you have the local infrastructure to work it, you'll never really get at the roots of these issues. So partnership has been a big one. And you see this in a lot of initiatives. PEPFAR, which was the presidential initiative to fight AIDS, started by the Bush administration, is not on what's called PEPFAR 2.0. And the goal of that is to still give a lot of funds, just not to US organizations. Give them to local and international organizations abroad to build capacity. Okay, so you're just gonna kind of get some snippets. One of the other really interesting aspects, I think, of trafficking that hasn't been looked at, and this is just a really recent kind of last 4 or 5 years, has been trafficking in public health. We, again, tend to look at this as a law enforcement problem where there's been a crime and punishment committed, but that ignores a lot of the other issues and exploitive natures of this. So this is a study that was done in India, outside of Calcutta. We interviewed 590-some sex workers in brothels in India. And the results are pretty dramatic because what they demonstrate is that little factors can have a huge impact on health choices and choices. So this is HIV rates. This is the amount of people. So back here, 8.6, which is a lot, but about the average for some sex workers in India tested positive. However, if you were from Nepal and you ended up in West Bengal, India, you had a 43% chance of having HIV. If you were from Bangladesh, 7.5%. And so this study particularly looked at sex workers regardless of where they were from. If somebody from Nepal comes over to India, they don't speak the same language. They don't share the same religion. They, for the most part, there are cultural differences here. And they don't have things like agency to negotiate what we call condom use. So USAID can spend millions of dollars on distributing condoms, but if they don't reach the people that they need to reach, you have these issues here. These are all challenges that we look at here. Okay, so one of the things Tim and I had talked about here was not to just give you kind of a regurgitation, but talk about maybe some of the challenges and counter maybe some of the reports here. And so I'm going to do this for a second. Numbers are all over the place. Researching this is really hard. It's really hard. Sometimes I wish I would study like frogs or something like that somewhere in like a lab where I could jump and they could be my pets or something, give them to the kids afterwards. But human beings are inherently complex, especially when you combine structural and social factors. It's difficult to get at this information from a policy perspective. It's difficult to get there from an agency perspective. And it's difficult to try to look at some of the numbers, stand up to some of the scientific models that we have. And I think that's caused a lot of my colleagues to say, you know what, I can't do this. I can't build a career on this. I can't affect the change I want to. For me and the people that I work with, it's driven us to just be more detail-orientated and try to just keep doing a better job, admitting, yeah, there's lots of mistakes. This is definitely not perfect, but we gotta keep trying. We gotta keep figuring out what the model is here. One of the issues is who counts as a trafficking victim? That's a big question. I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes in much more detail as it pertains to this study. But do you have to have a conviction? Do you have to have a trafficker? Do you have to have somebody that says, yes, I've left what they call the life? And this mostly refers to sexual exploitation. But even in the case of indentured servitude, I've signed off that I will be your slave for the next several years, and I'm paying off debts of my grandfather. Is that trafficking? These are really, really hard things to answer. Speaking for the victims, so perhaps in this area, I have seen this more than any other place that I have. I have, especially early on, I have seen more NGOs, more government officials, myself included, speaking on behalf of the victim or a survivor, saying what they have needed, and not including them in decision-making, in research policy decisions, in justice decisions. And it's been a big deal. The problem with the law enforcement model, one of the challenges is that many times it's not what they call victim-centered justice. So as a prosecutor, what I wanted was a conviction, whether the victim wanted that or not. And if they were uncooperative, then they just weren't falling in line and didn't understand what I was trying to do. As opposed to me, maybe not understanding what's in the best interests of justice. Hard thing to do. But of course, when the government is counting how many prosecutions that you have had and how many successful ones of those, you see where the pressure lies in those cases. One-size-fits-all solutions, challenging. In the beginning, we liked to fund SWAT teams that would go in and break doors down with guns ablazing. We loved to do that. We did that in the Philippines. We did that in India. We did that in Nepal. We did that in some of the former Soviet countries. We did that in Europe. And some of them were immediately effective. But there was a very interesting article that came out in 2005 by a woman named Gretchen Soderlund. And the title of that article was Running from the Rescuers. And indeed, what it documented were several well-known cases of US-funded SWAT teams going in, breaking down doors, rounding up people in houses of prostitution, removing them from these compounds, taking them and putting them in the police station, right? Probably like not the best place to put them. And the first thing they do is run back to their exploiter or the house of prostitution with their cell phones and talk about the concept of voluntariness and what I do. So again, very difficult things. Okay, prostitution and trafficking. So this probably has been the most decisive issue within the trafficking community. There are some schools of thought that say every act of prostitution is a trafficking act, that every act is forced coercion, that why would another human being consent to sell their body or parts of their body or rent parts of it out unless it was exploitive. And there are some groups that say that's absolutely wrong, that sex work is a legitimate work, it's been around for a long time, and indeed the largest union in West Bengal, India, is DMSC, which is the sex workers union. How this manifests itself becomes really interesting. So the Bush administration passed, the Supreme Court has overturned this as of 2 years ago, something called the Anti-Prostitution Pledge, which says that if you receive United States funds, anything, for PEPFAR funds, for family planning, for HIV, for anti-trafficking work, you have to take an anti-prostitution pledge, which says none of these funds will go to support or groups that support prostitution. You can see how this may be a great policy if you believe this and you're sitting in the halls of Washington, D.C., but if you're trying to do an HIV study with sex workers in West Bengal, India, and you have to work with the Union of Sex Workers, they're not going to sign a statement that says, we have an anti-prostitution pledge. So it complicates these issues exponential funds. And in fact, we did that study without federal funds. Okay, two more. Framing the issue and the immediate demand for results. Grants and funders want to see results. That's what they want to see, and they want to see them in a shorter and shorter time frame. So grants are getting shorter. They're not getting longer, especially as funding for research dwindles. And I get this. People need to show results in things, but again, it's really difficult to quantify some of this stuff. What's a success? What's a successful trafficking program? What's a successful program when you know if you take kids off the streets that are in commercial sexual exploitation, that 80% of them will run within 72 hours. But you know what? They come back. Or you know what? They stay in contact with their caseworker, and maybe they don't come back in a month or 2 months, but they do come back in 6 months. Very, very difficult to measure. Framing the issue, you've heard me talk about this before. This is the idea between a law enforcement and a public health frame, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. So this I just put up last night as I was bleary-eyed and going through things. And it's interesting. There are new security challenges. Terrorism used to be, and political terrorism used to be defined at entities, not individuals, for political purposes. But now we seem to have much more of a focus on trafficking in terms of terrorism for both funding groups, and there have been very recent cases of ISIS, especially in Kurdistan minority, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and then, of course, the use of children in attacks for illegal purposes, and child soldiers continues to be an issue as some low-intensity conflicts keep arising. Okay, I spoke way too long on that. That's the global. So now we're going to talk about Portland a little bit. I'm going to move through these slides pretty quick because I want to kind of get to phase 2. So as Tim promised you, you can all be invited to that party. So Lena, who is not here, OHSU stole her from me. I'm kidding. She's now an employee at OHSU, and she's doing great. But you know, students that go, it's bittersweet. You hate to see them go, but you're so proud of them when they get out and do this. And I could not have done any of these reports without Lena, who is not here today, but maybe watching on simulcast. And she was just a tremendous asset and spent lots of time on the ground in the trenches. So my name is here, but she takes as much credit as I do for this. 2 phases. I'm going to move through this first one really quickly. The report's up and available on the U.S. Attorney's website. I can make other reports available to the World Affairs Council if you want to see it. The first issue was the U.S. Attorney approached me about 6 years ago, maybe a little less, and said, I want to work on a trafficking issue in Portland. I said, how do you know you have a problem? She says, because people tell me so. I say, OK. Who are those people? She's like, you know, those people. And I said, no, I actually don't know those people, but I'd really like to know how many kids are trafficked. So from a law enforcement frame, I said, actually what I said was no first, but US attorneys can make you do things sometimes you don't want to do, and I've known Amanda for about 25 years. So we're comfortable, so she called a meeting and she said, Professor Carey is going to do this study, and so we did. The first thing I did was said, well, let's look at law enforcement, right? Let's look at prosecutions. Let's see how many cases have been reported. Well, there's a problem with that, right? A small percentage of these cases are reported to the cops. A smaller portion of these cases are then referred to for investigation. A smaller portion go to the DA's office. A smaller portion of those get grand juried or issued informations, and in this case, they're almost all felonies, so they'd be a grand jury. A smaller percentage of those go to trial, and a smaller percentage of those get convicted. So law enforcement starts out like this, and what comes out the end. So if I just counted successful prosecutions, I'm missing a whole bunch of stuff, right? Law enforcement probably wasn't the best frame. So we looked at a public health model. We looked at one of our partners, the Department of Human Services. These are the unsung heroes in CSEC or commercial exploitation of children in the Portland metro area. They are underpaid. They work in difficult conditions. They put in ridiculous amounts of hours. Their cell phones are tied to their hips, and they get calls from their clients 24/7. But without their help, none of this would have been possible. So what did we do? We looked at DHS and the Sexual Assault Resource Center, SARC, which is also a great organization on the west side. They do extensive programs here. What we did is we looked at documented the cases for DHS that came through the child abuse hotline for 4 years that made it past the initial screener. Of those, there were 469 unduplicated survivors by both these groups in the Portland metro area. July of 2015, there were 159 open cases of those. What are some of the relevant findings from this? 15.5 is the average age. The youngest one was 8. The oldest was 22. 94%, 96 are female. 40% are Caucasian. 27% of the victims are African American. That's an overrepresentation by 5 times the population of African Americans. Pretty shocking. Health history, 16.5 have kids of their own. So there's policy implications because almost 20% of them are parents themselves. 8% are adopted. We'll talk about this in the later one. 62%, this is by SARC, are dealing with some form of addiction, which means that there are these underlying causes that if you don't treat those, you don't get it. 49% had a gang connection. I'll talk about this later. 11% by a family member, and 20% of victims have a family history of exploitation. Somebody in their family was exploited. What's next? So this was the end of the first one. here's the party that you get to go to. So you're hearing this for the first time. I'm sharing some of this data for the first time. It's in raw data form, so any analysis that you have for me, I'd love to hear. Phase 2 said, all right, we want you to standardize some of this data collection. We want you to do more in depth. So what did we do? We went in, and remember the first one, we took a broad look. We took 44 open and active cases and cracked them open and did an in-depth analysis of each of them. In the same time, interviewing each caseworker assigned to this. Lots of confidentiality, lots of HIPAA requirements, lots of requirements to go through before we even began this process. We're training multidisciplinary teams. We're looking at screening categories. So the hopes is that all DHSs around the country can use this. And Oregon is actually on the cutting edge of doing some of this stuff. People are trying to count, but it is very much what the article says. People are all over the board, and we're not really sure where we're going to land. Here's some of the disproportionate, so here's some of the key summary findings. They're disproportionately children of color. Most have a history of sexual abuse. If you enter the foster care system early and have many foster placements, you are much higher likely and at risk to be a victim of commercial sexual exploitation. And I'll show you the average number. It's pretty shocking. Many have their own kids. And this new thing that we're finding out in Portland is there is this deep overlay between street gangs in this city and the commercial sexual exploitation of kids. And prostitution in general, but particular here. Okay, so remember, the N is 44, right? 44, so this is a subset of the other category. Over 36% are multiracial. It's a question that we didn't ask on the first one. There may be implications for that. 95% are female. Just under 12% identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. 17 is the average age of the youth that are in the sample. The youngest is 14, and the oldest is 20. So this is older than the first study. So we know the active and open cases, somehow the older girls and older kids and the other ones are either slipping through the cracks or they're disappearing, or for some reason there's other things. Just give me 1 second, and then I'll be done. Okay. Okay. 45% entered the child welfare system from birth to 2. 45%. So think about the implications of this down the road. So in public health, we have upstream and downstream, and I'm not going to kind of go into that, but one tries to work before it becomes a problem. The other one works after it becomes a problem. If you're designing programs, this is a huge number. 16% have been adopted. 4 of the 7 youth are from failed adoptions. So in the subset, this is not failed adoptions are not a zero-sum game. There are stakes and at risk with these. You can't just make up with it with a better adoptive family later. Okay, now this is DHS only. So normal to think that 95% are currently in foster care. 40% have spent 4 to 6 years. But check this out. The average placement, the average per youth is 11. The medium is 9.5, but the average. So if you're a child in the foster system as a victim of commercial sexual exploitation, you have on average been in 11 different home placements in the foster care system. That's an issue to work on. And what do we do about that from a training perspective? What do we do about those things? Okay, avenues of exploitation. 1/3 of the youth in the family has been exploited. 45% have a history of involvement with the juvenile justice system. This is what we call crossover youth. Justice system involvement, and OYA actually reports, Oregon Youth Authority, a higher number than that. That's another study. 56% have been exploited online. We know that number is probably greater than that. 30%, these next 2 numbers are kind of interesting. 30% of the victims are gang affiliated. And almost 40% have been exploited by somebody within a gang. So a large percentage of these kids have been focused in street gangs in Portland. 13% by a family member, 18% by a strip club, and again, definitions of what this is and what that is are also kind of challenging and hard to come by. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here. 63% are in school. Of those, the majority are on individual education programs. 67% attend an alternative school. So we know they're in school at some point, which is a really good thing. So if you're designing policies, you might want to focus on those sort of things. 90% have a history of abuse or neglect prior to the exploitation. Again, predictive factor. 80% sexual abuse at the hands of family or strangers as kids. 70% neglect. 62% have experienced physical abuse. Some of these we know, we kind of knew this anecdotally, but we couldn't quantify it till now. These two, this one I think is really interesting as well. 60% have been exposed to domestic violence, which means the effects of which means if this holds up, that you see effects of domestic violence that I think we never anticipated before. 75% have a mental health diagnosis. 70% history of controlled substance use. Again, big debate, whether it's an addiction or use or abuse, but we know there are underlying issues. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions, but this last one as well is 60% have a diagnosis of PTSD. Okay, I spoke way too long. We have about 11 or 12 minutes, I think, and I guess US Bank can wait a little bit, right? So thank you guys for listening to me. I'm sorry I talked long, got a lot of information, but any questions you have, let me know.
I was just interested in what is the average age of the gang members in Portland?
I don't know, but I can tell you, so I don't know, which my students know those are like the three most important words you can use, right? I don't know if you don't know something. So I don't know. However, I have seen both in legally and not anywhere from 12-year-olds to 45 and 50-year-olds who run the gangs. Some gangs in Portland tend to be generational and tied to families, so you generally have a curve. So.
What's the margin of error in a study that only has 44 cases?
Okay, so that's another good question. So the smaller the amount of cases, generally the less margin of error that you have, right? So because you are a really tightly controlled group. When you look at predictive, I would not use this as a predictive model. I would not say, based on this data, we know that this will happen for sure. So again, I don't have an answer into like the margin of error, like a pollster would do, right? The margin of error is 3 or 4%. I don't think we know. This is what we can say, though. We can say, of those 44 cases, that what we did was pull this information out of. So this exists in those 44 cases. What I can't speak to is if these cases are representative of all of those other cases, or all those other 469 cases, or even more problematic, if I can admit to problems in the old research, is that we know that those 469 are the reported cases. What do we know then if they're just the reported cases? We know that there's more, and those unreported cases may look very different. So that's not a great answer to your question, but that's the best I got. But good, yes?
Quick question.
Sure.
And this was brought up 25 years ago by a doctor friend of mine who said, why is the US so heavy into putting children who are from all kinds of horrible families into other homes? Why not go back to the situation of having orphanages with professionals so that they have a really good start, continued care under better supervision?
Okay, so I'm not an expert on this, but actually we do have an expert, and Dr. Lynn Messer is not here, but she actually has researched this internationally, orphanages versus foster homes, and I think some of her research says that there's really not that much of a difference in an international level. I don't know what the difference is domestically. I know that we have tended to get away from that because we don't want to institutionalize kids we know that there are really specific things. So I'll give you a really specific answer with this population. We know that if you are a C-sex survivor, they don't mix really well with other populations. So if you have a kid that's addicted to heroin and doesn't do commercial sexual exploitation, if you put those groups together, they don't mix really well. And in fact, there's been a couple of cases in Portland where the C-sex kids have said, hey, I know where you can get some money and go get some drugs, let's take off, and they have. So, but that's an anecdotal information. So sure.
I'm talking about getting these children in early where they don't have real parents, getting them in early so that they would be kind of in a college or a school situation, full-time, where they are not being susceptible to all of this.
So again, this is good. We've had these discussions as well. So this is how the debate here takes the frame a little different. If you put them in a college, is it a secured facility? Is it not a secured facility? The department, DHS, they don't lock kids up. That's what OYA does. But if you don't have a secured facility, then they run. But maybe that's okay if they run. So this debate is framed a little differently right now, but it's the same issues that come up. Do you take them out of their environment? Do you leave them in? Do you keep them in a foster home where they can get individual placement? Or do you put them somewhere together where there can be kind of a holistic approach and remove them from the situation? I wish I had good answers.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you could give us the median age, not just the average age of the participants, because I think you might be able to draw some better correlations between the median age and education.
Yeah, I can't off of like I don't have it off the top of my head right now, but that is something that certainly we can take a look at. And if you want to send me an email afterwards, I'm more than happy to share some of that with you as well.
In our daily lives, when we're traveling or living in our own homes, how can we watch for how we can help? How can we perhaps spot someone who needs help? And if we do that, then what do we do?
What do we do?
How can we help?
So I get this question a lot. And my response is always, thank you so much for being concerned and part of the community. There's lots of organizations, both locally and internationally, that you can volunteer at. SARC has a training program. Share to Hope has a training program from Vancouver. There are many churches. East Rotary, I don't know if there are any Rotarians in the room. They are very, very active, especially along 82nd Avenue in this issue. But what I would say is if you see a child that is in distress, you need to call the police. Many of us in this room are mandatory reporters. Professors now are mandatory reporters as well, which means that if we suspect any sort of child exploitation or abuse, we have to call it in or it's a misdemeanor. And so, you know, I would say if you see that, look at some of the trainings locally and they can kind of identify. Most victims don't jump out at you. They don't say, yeah, I'm a victim of trafficking, come help me. And so they're hidden. But sometimes things are right in front of you and they're obvious. Other times they're not so obvious. So